A $3 drug is saving millions in Africa. Why can't we get it here? There is a pill that costs $3. Not $3 for a month's supply. Not $3 per dose in a course of treatment. $3 total. For the full treatment. Start to finish. This pill has been shown, in rigorous clinical trials conducted by some of the world's leading research institutions, to reduce mortality from one of the deadliest diseases on Earth by up to 90%. In communities where it has been deployed at scale, child mortality has dropped dramatically. Hospital admissions have fallen. Families that would have buried children are instead watching them grow up. $3. 90% reduction in mortality. Millions of lives saved. You have almost certainly never heard of it. And depending on where you live, you almost certainly cannot get it. Not because it doesn't exist, not because it's too complicated to manufacture, not because the science is uncertain, but because of a system so tangled, so corrupted by money and politics and institutional inertia, that a $3 miracle sits just out of reach of the people who need it most. This is the story of that drug. And of all the drugs like it. And of the system that decides, quietly, bureaucratically, without drama or visible cruelty, who gets to live and who doesn't. To understand why cheap drugs don't reach the people who need them, you have to understand how drugs get made and who pays for the making of them. Developing a new drug is extraordinarily expensive. The pharmaceutical industry frequently cites figures of $1 to $2 billion as the average cost of bringing a new drug from initial research through clinical trials to regulatory approval. The actual number is disputed. Critics argue it's substantially inflated by accounting practices that include the cost of failed drugs and the opportunity cost of capital. But even accounting for that inflation, drug development is genuinely expensive. It takes years. It involves enormous scientific uncertainty. Most drugs that enter clinical trials never make it to market. Someone has to pay for all of that. And in the current system, the entity that pays for it, the pharmaceutical company, recovers its investment and generates its profit through the price it charges for the drug once it's approved. This creates a straightforward economic logic. Price the drug based on what the market will bear. Charge what insurance companies, governments, and wealthy patients will pay. Generate the revenue needed to recoup the investment and fund the next round of research. The problem is that this logic works reasonably well in wealthy countries with robust healthcare systems and large populations of insured patients. And it fails catastrophically for diseases that primarily affect poor countries. If your patient population is concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, or South Asia, or rural Southeast Asia, places where per capita income might be a few dollars a day, then what the market will bear is almost nothing. There is no market in the economic sense for a drug priced at what it would cost to recoup a billion-dollar development investment. So the drug doesn't get developed. Or if it does get developed, it doesn't get manufactured for those markets. Or if it gets manufactured, it doesn't get distributed. Or if it gets distributed, it doesn't get to the right people at the right time. Each step in the chain is a potential point of failure. And in the global health system as it currently exists, all of those failure points are operating simultaneously. The disease that most dramatically illustrates this problem is malaria. Malaria is caused by a parasite, Plasmodium, transmitted through the bite of infected mosquitoes. It has been killing humans for thousands of years. It is mentioned in ancient Chinese medical texts from 3,000 years ago. It shaped the history of ancient Rome. It influenced the outcomes of wars from the American Civil War to the First World War. Today, malaria kills somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000 people every year. The vast majority of those deaths, over 90%, occur in sub-Saharan Africa. And the majority of the deaths in sub-Saharan Africa are children under 5 years old. Let that land for a moment. A disease that has been known to humanity for 3,000 years. A disease we understand completely at the biological level. A disease for which effective treatments exist. And it is still killing 500,000 people every year, most of them children, most of them in Africa. Why? The treatments exist. Artemisinin-based combination therapies, ACTs, are highly effective against malaria. When administered correctly and promptly, they can reduce mortality dramatically. They're not extraordinarily expensive to manufacture. The raw materials for artemisinin come from a plant, Artemisia annua, sweet wormwood, that grows readily in multiple climates. The problem is not the science. The problem is everything else. Distribution, supply chains, healthcare infrastructure, diagnostic capacity, community health worker training, cold storage for temperature-sensitive medications, transport in regions with few paved roads, corruption in procurement systems, stockouts at rural health facilities, counterfeit drugs flooding markets where regulatory oversight is weak. And underneath all of that, the fundamental economic reality that the people who need these drugs most have the least ability to pay for them, which means that the pharmaceutical companies and distributors who could deliver them have the least financial incentive to do so. In 2015, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded in part to a Chinese scientist named Tu Youyou. Tu had been researching traditional Chinese medicine in the 1960s and 1970s, during the Cultural Revolution, as part of a secret military project to find new treatments for malaria, which was devastating North Vietnamese soldiers fighting in jungle conditions, and which China had been asked to help address. She reviewed thousands of traditional remedies. She found a reference to Artemisia annua, sweet wormwood, in a text written 1600 years ago. After numerous failed extraction attempts, she tried a new method, a low-temperature extraction that preserved the active compound, and found something extraordinary. The compound, which she named artemisinin, was dramatically effective against the malaria parasite in laboratory tests. It took decades for her discovery to reach the world. The secrecy of the original research project, combined with the political chaos of the Cultural Revolution, meant that Tu's findings were not published internationally until the 1980s. And it took further decades for artemisinin-based treatments to be properly developed, tested, standardized, and deployed at scale. The World Health Organization now recommends artemisinin-based combination therapies as the first-line treatment for uncomplicated malaria. They work. They are relatively cheap. They save lives. But in 2023, the WHO estimated that there were 249 million cases of malaria worldwide, and over 600,000 deaths. The treatment exists. The deaths continue. Malaria is the most dramatic example, but it is far from the only one. There is a category of diseases that the WHO calls neglected tropical diseases, NTDs. These are a group of infections that collectively affect more than 1 billion people, primarily in the poorest communities in the world. They include diseases like lymphatic filariasis, which causes the grotesque swelling known as elephantiasis; schistosomiasis, a parasitic infection spread through contaminated water; trachoma, a bacterial infection that is the world's leading cause of preventable blindness; onchocerciasis, river blindness. These diseases cause enormous suffering. They cause disability, disfigurement, blindness, cognitive impairment in children, and death. They trap communities in poverty by reducing the ability of adults to work and children to learn. And they are neglected, the word is right there in the name, because they primarily affect people who have no economic power, who cannot pay for the drugs that would cure or control them, who are, in the cold logic of a market-driven pharmaceutical system, not a profitable customer base. For some NTDs, effective treatments do exist, and have existed for decades. Ivermectin, for example, is extraordinarily effective against river blindness and lymphatic filariasis. It can be manufactured for pennies per dose. When distributed at scale through community health programs, it can essentially eliminate these diseases from entire regions. Merck, the pharmaceutical company that manufactures ivermectin, has run a donation program since 1987 that has provided the drug free of charge to communities at risk of river blindness. It is, by almost any measure, one of the most successful public health programs in history. Hundreds of millions of doses have been distributed. River blindness has been eliminated from several countries. And yet the program exists because Merck made a corporate decision to donate the drug, not because the system created any mechanism that required or incentivized it to do so. The drug costs pennies. The disease causes blindness. Without a specific corporate decision to donate, the people who needed the drug would not have gotten it. That is the system. Then there are the drugs that exist, that work, and that are affordable, and still don't reach people, for reasons that have nothing to do with price. Oral rehydration therapy is perhaps the most dramatic example. Diarrheal disease is one of the leading killers of children under 5 in low-income countries. The mechanism of death is simple. Severe diarrhea causes dehydration, and dehydration kills. The treatment is also simple. Replace the lost fluids and electrolytes. Oral rehydration therapy, ORT, is a solution of water, salt and sugar, mixed in specific proportions. When administered correctly, it can prevent the vast majority of deaths from diarrheal disease. It costs almost nothing. The ingredients are available almost everywhere. It requires no medical equipment, no refrigeration, no complex training to administer. A mother can mix it in her kitchen. The development of ORT in the 1960s and 1970s was hailed as one of the great medical breakthroughs of the 20th century. The Lancet, one of the world's most prestigious medical journals, called it potentially the most important medical advance of the 20th century. And yet, decades after its development, hundreds of thousands of children were still dying each year from diarrheal dehydration. Not because ORT didn't work. Not because it was too expensive. Not because it was too complicated. Because it didn't reach them. Because parents didn't know about it. Because health workers hadn't been trained to recommend it. Because the system of distribution and communication and health education that would have been needed to deploy it universally had not been built. A solution of water, salt and sugar, costing a few cents, and children were dying because nobody told their mothers how to make it. The story of HIV treatment in Africa is perhaps the most politically charged and morally clarifying chapter in the history of global health inequity. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, HIV was devastating sub-Saharan Africa. Countries like Botswana, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Swaziland had infection rates among adults of 20, 25, even 35%. Life expectancy in some of these countries had fallen by a decade or more from its pre-epidemic levels. A generation of adults, parents, teachers, farmers, workers, was being wiped out. Children were being left as orphans by the millions. Antiretroviral therapy, ART, had been developed and was available in wealthy countries by the mid-1990s. By 1996, combination antiretroviral therapy had transformed HIV from a death sentence into a manageable chronic condition in the United States and Europe. People who had been dying were returning to health. AIDS wards were emptying. In Africa, meanwhile, the epidemic was accelerating. The antiretroviral drugs were patented. The patents were held primarily by Western pharmaceutical companies. The drugs were priced for Western markets. At the time, a full course of antiretroviral therapy cost roughly $10,000 to $15,000 per patient per year. In a country where per capita income was a few $100s a year, that price was not a deterrent. It was a death sentence. Generic manufacturers, primarily in India, where patent law at the time allowed the production of generic versions of patented drugs, could produce antiretrovirals for a fraction of the cost. Indian generic manufacturers were producing versions of the same drugs for under $300 per patient per year. Some eventually got the cost down below $150. But the Western pharmaceutical companies held the patents. And they, along with the United States government, which was heavily lobbied by the pharmaceutical industry, opposed the use of generic antiretrovirals in Africa on the grounds that it violated intellectual property law. Read that again. The United States government, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, was actively working to prevent dying African patients from accessing cheap generic versions of life-saving drugs, because doing so might undermine pharmaceutical patent protections. The argument was that without patent protections, pharmaceutical companies would lose the incentive to develop new drugs. That intellectual property rights were the engine of pharmaceutical innovation, and weakening them, even for a specific disease in a specific region, would have long-term costs that outweighed the short-term benefit of cheaper drugs. It is an argument that has a certain abstract economic logic. It is also an argument that, when applied concretely, meant that millions of people died who didn't have to. The crisis was eventually partially resolved through a combination of international pressure, activism, particularly the extraordinary advocacy of organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières and the Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa, and policy changes that created mechanisms for compulsory licensing and differential pricing. The U.S. government's PEPFAR program, launched in 2003 by President George W. Bush, committed $15 billion to fighting HIV in Africa and became one of the most effective global health interventions in history. By allowing the purchase of generic antiretrovirals, PEPFAR was able to treat far more people than would have been possible at branded drug prices. But it took an epidemic that killed millions, years of activism, political battles fought on multiple continents, and an extraordinary act of political will to get there. And the structural problem, the fundamental misalignment between the economics of drug development and the health needs of poor populations, was not solved. It was worked around in this specific case, through a combination of political pressure and public funding. The next epidemic that primarily affects poor people will face the same problem. There is a concept in global health called the 10/90ths gap. The figure refers to the observation that historically, roughly 90% of global health research and development spending has been directed at diseases that affect 10% of the world's population, primarily the wealthy 10%. And roughly 10% of research and development spending has gone to the diseases that affect the other 90%. The figure is imprecise, and the ratio has improved somewhat in recent decades through the work of organizations like the Gates Foundation and various product development partnerships. But the basic insight remains valid. The diseases that kill the most people are not necessarily the diseases that attract the most research funding. Because research funding, in a market-driven system, follows profit potential. And profit potential follows the ability to pay. A drug that cures a rare genetic condition affecting a few thousand wealthy patients in developed countries can be priced at hundreds of thousands of dollars per patient, making it enormously profitable despite the small patient population. A drug that cures a common infection affecting hundreds of millions of poor people in developing countries cannot be priced high enough to generate similar returns. The market, left to itself, will produce the first drug. It will not produce the second. This is not a criticism of pharmaceutical companies per se. They are operating rationally within the incentive structure that exists. The failure is of the incentive structure itself. There are people working to fix it. The Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, DND, was founded in 2003 by Médecins Sans Frontières and several public research institutions. Its model is explicitly non-profit. It develops drugs for neglected diseases by pooling public funding and shared intellectual property, with the goal of making treatments available at the lowest possible cost. DND has developed several treatments that would not otherwise exist, including drugs for sleeping sickness, visceral leishmaniasis, and pediatric HIV, at a fraction of the cost of conventional drug development. Its most successful treatment, a drug for visceral leishmaniasis called DNDi-0690, was developed for approximately $50 million, a small fraction of the billion plus that conventional drug development is said to cost. The model works. But it operates at the margins of the global health system, dependent on philanthropic funding, vulnerable to shifts in donor priorities, unable to replicate itself across the full range of neglected diseases that need attention. The Medicines Patent Pool, established in 2010, negotiates with pharmaceutical companies to license their patents for use by generic manufacturers in low-income countries. It has successfully expanded access to antiretroviral drugs, hepatitis C treatments, and COVID-19 therapeutics. But it depends on the willingness of patent holders to negotiate, and not all patent holders are willing. The Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, CEPI, was established after the Ebola outbreak of 2014 to 2016 to fund the development of vaccines for epidemic diseases that lack commercial markets. It played a crucial role in the rapid development of COVID-19 vaccines. But it focuses on epidemic preparedness, not the chronic persistent burden of neglected diseases. Each of these organizations is doing important work. Each is filling a gap that the market has left. And each is, in some sense, a workaround, an adaptation to a broken system rather than a fix of the system itself. The COVID-19 pandemic threw the inequities of the global health system into unusually sharp relief. When the pandemic struck in 2020, the world watched as wealthy countries raced to secure vaccine doses, often buying up supplies far in excess of what their populations needed, while low-income countries struggled to access any doses at all. The phrase vaccine apartheid entered the global conversation. The vaccines were developed in record time, a genuine scientific triumph, made possible by extraordinary public investment in the research that underpinned the mRNA vaccine technology and in the Operation Warp Speed program in the United States. Governments provided billions in funding, guaranteed purchases, and regulatory fast-tracking that made the rapid development possible. And then the vaccines were patented. And the companies that held the patents priced them for wealthy markets. And the doses went primarily to wealthy countries. By the time vaccines were reaching low-income countries at scale, more than a year after wealthy countries had vaccinated most of their populations, the variants that emerged from high-transmission, low-vaccination populations had already spread globally. The pandemic that might have been controlled faster with more equitable vaccine distribution dragged on longer and killed more people than it might otherwise have. The inequity of vaccine access was not just a moral failure. It was an epidemiological one. And yet, the system responded. The COVAX facility, despite significant difficulties, did eventually distribute vaccines to lower-income countries. The medicines patent pool negotiated licenses for COVID treatments. Wealthy countries donated doses. The response was slow, inadequate, and inequitable, but it existed. It happened. Some version of global solidarity manifested. What the pandemic demonstrated is both the capacity of the global health system to mobilize extraordinary resources when the political will exists, and the extent to which that political will is dependent on wealthy countries feeling directly threatened. When the disease is COVID, and the wealthy world is affected, resources materialize. When the disease is malaria, and the deaths are concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, the resources are thin. The $3 pill at the beginning of this story is not one specific drug. It is a composite, a representation of what is possible when the barriers between scientific knowledge, manufacturing capacity, and human need are removed. When a drug that can be made cheaply actually reaches the people who need it cheaply. When the system works the way it should. There are specific examples that come close. Artemisinin-based malaria treatments, in markets where generic competition has driven prices down, can cost just a few dollars for a full course. Oral rehydration salts, the water salt sugar solution, cost pennies. Ivermectin, where it is donated or sold at cost, costs almost nothing. Certain tuberculosis treatments, under generic competition, cost less than $20 for a full 6-month course. These drugs exist. The knowledge to make them exists. The manufacturing capacity exists. What often doesn't exist is the will, political, economic, institutional, to get them from where they're made to where they're needed. There is a thought experiment that global health economists sometimes use. Imagine that a disease emerged tomorrow in Western Europe or North America. A new infectious disease, causing rapid death, with a mortality rate of 20 to 30% in children under 5. Within months, it was killing hundreds of thousands of people. How quickly would resources mobilize? How fast would research programs start? How soon would governments commit emergency funding? How rapidly would the regulatory system move to fast-track treatments? The answer, as COVID demonstrated, is very fast. Extraordinarily fast. The combination of public fear, political pressure, economic disruption, and institutional capacity that wealthy countries can bring to bear on a health crisis is genuinely formidable. Now imagine that the same disease had been killing the same number of people in sub-Saharan Africa for decades. How much has been spent on it? How many research programs are running? How much political attention does it receive? The answer for malaria is some. More than nothing. But not enough. Not remotely commensurate with the scale of the problem. The disease is the same. The deaths are the same. The children dying are equally human, equally loved, equally mourned by the parents who lose them. The difference is where they're dying. And that difference, that geographical and economic accident of birth, is the thing that determines, more than almost any other factor, whether a person who gets sick will have access to a $3 treatment that could save their life. This is not a story without hope. The progress made in global health over the last 30 years is real and substantial. Child mortality worldwide has fallen dramatically. The number of people dying from malaria each year, while still far too high, is significantly lower than it was 2 decades ago. HIV deaths in Africa have fallen from their peak. Neglected tropical diseases are being eliminated, one by one, in country after country. The tools work. The science is there. The people doing this work, the researchers, the public health workers, the community health volunteers, the activists, the doctors working in resource-poor settings, are doing extraordinary things with inadequate resources. What is needed is not more invention. What is needed is more will. The will to fund the development of drugs that the market will not develop on its own. The will to manufacture them in sufficient quantities. The will to build the distribution systems and train the health workers and educate the communities that would allow those drugs to reach the people who need them. The will to accept that intellectual property rights, however important for innovation, cannot be an absolute barrier to access when lives are at stake. The $3 pill exists. The question is whether we are willing to make sure it gets to everyone who needs it. That question is not a scientific one. It is a moral one. And the answer we give to it, collectively, through our politics and our institutions and our choices, will determine how many people live and how many people die in the decades ahead. The drug costs $3. The question is whether we think the people who need it are worth $3.